question. Maybe you can help me to understand. For example, recently Elohim Cyclopea said that the main trick of the fallen beings is the standard they have imposed on human beings, right and wrong, good and bad, etc. Because of this, there are many doubts and problems. On the other hand, the Ascended Masters convey that dark forces are behind this or that human activity, and we distort pure energy to feed them. And even relatively innocent activities can also be connected with this process. So there are standards after all. Well, it's a good question because it's an easy thing to misunderstand when you start hearing about Ascended Master teachings. So what the Masters have said is that there was a point where there were no fallen beings on earth. And if you are not familiar with the concept of fallen beings, you need to watch my video, How the World Was Created, because it explains it in there in depth. So to avoid repeating it all, I'm just going to assume you know what a fallen being is. So fallen beings have rebelled against the process of spiritual growth, self-transcendence. And so there was a point where the fallen beings were allowed to embody on earth, and the only thing they really had to do to make things difficult, to create conflict and problems, was to impose this idea that there is a standard that is defined here on earth that people have to live up to. Now there's of course has been historically more than one standard, but you see, for example, Christianity. The angry judgmental God in the sky has imposed this standard for what it requires for you to go to heaven, and if you don't live up to the standard, you're going to go to hell. And this means that Christians, or anybody who believes in this, are put into this frame of mind of trying to live up to a standard, but that standard was defined here on earth by the fallen beings based on what I've called the consciousness of separation, the dualistic state of mind where there's two opposite polarities. So the whole idea of the fallen beings and their standard is there's one dualistic polarity here and another dualistic polarity there. They are opposites, like good and bad, right and wrong, true and false, good and evil, God and the devil. Right? So you have to live up to the standard for what it means to be a good religious person, then you'll go to heaven. But see, that standard is defined based on the duality consciousness. And the duality consciousness is the opposite, or not really the opposite, but it's outside of the Christ consciousness, the consciousness of oneness, the one mind. And the key to going to heaven or the spiritual realm is to unite, connect with, and unite with the one mind, your higher self. Because you can't go into heaven while you are divided between these two dualistic polarities. That's what keeps you in separation. And you can't be in separation and oneness at the same time. So you see that whatever people do to try and live up to this standard, even if they're trying to be good Christians or good spiritual people, they will never get to the kingdom of God or the spiritual realm. They will never get to oneness by trying to live up to a standard defined in separation. Okay. So what is it the Ascended Masters are doing when they're saying that there are certain activities here on earth that are qualifying energy, for example, with a lower vibration, and this will pull on our four lower bodies and therefore pull us away from oneness with our higher self? Is that imposing a standard? No, because first of all, it's not a standard defined based on duality. This is again, this is an example of what I've called Serpentine logic, where the Serpentine logic will say, oh, but what you just said is that we shouldn't judge according to the standard. But now you're saying you're judging based on whether it's accordance with the one mind or not. Isn't that a form of judgment? But that's Serpentine logic. See, the reality is that that which is apart from the one mind, or in opposition to the one mind, or created outside of the one mind, as I said, in separation and duality, will keep you from oneness. But this is not a standard that's opposed here on Earth. It's not a standard based on two dualistic polarities, because the two dualistic polarities exist only in relation to each other. And that's why I was saying earlier that the separate mind is really not in opposition to the Christ mind, because the Christ mind is the mind of oneness. It has no opposition. But there are just certain realities, you know. Is the law of gravity, is that a standard imposed upon mankind? No, because it wasn't defined by human beings, right? And you may say, well, but gravity limits what I can do. Does it really? If there was no gravity, where would you be? You would be floating around in outer space, and pretty soon the atmosphere would be so thin you couldn't breathe. So, there are certain natural laws or conditions that are simply, this is how the universe we are in has taken on the specific form it has. You could theorize there are other universes where gravity is not an attractive force, it's a repulsive force. But right here, right now on Earth, we are attracted to the surface of the Earth, we walk on the surface of the Earth, and it's not a man-made standard. So that's why I'm saying the Christ mind that says this takes you away from oneness and this takes you closer to oneness, it's not an artificial dualistic standard defined by the separate mind. It's just, this is the one mind. So you've been given free will. If you want to stay in separation or go deeper into separation, you have the right to do this. But then you don't need the Christ mind. Then you are separating yourself from the Christ mind. But if you want to come back into oneness because you've had enough of separation, then you need the Christ mind to get back into oneness. And then you simply need to learn to use the Christ mind to discern what happens with your energies. I mean, I remember being 8 years old at some school ball where they had normal waltz dancing upstairs, and then there was the basement where they had one of the first rock orchestras in Denmark. And I went down there out of curiosity, and I could feel how my energies were being forced down into the base chakra, and it felt very unpleasant. And from that moment on, I never listened to rock music voluntarily in my life. And so that's just, it's not a standard you're imposing with a mind that argues for or against it. It was just an experience that this lowers my energy. I don't want that. And the same thing, people who were drunk, I could sense they had a lower vibration. Why would I want to go into that? So I'm just saying, as you walk the path and have more of a connection to the one mind, you begin to be able to discern these kind of things. But it's not an outer standard. You see, the standard imposed by the fallen beings is, first of all, there's a standard you have to live up to. And here is the standard. So this puts you in this, instead of just acting spontaneously, you are evaluating with the mind before you do something. Is this living up to the standard? Is this what it means? Can I do this and still be a good Christian? So you have this artificial evaluation there, instead of spontaneously coming from connection to the one mind, where you just act in a way that is in accordance with the one mind. So you don't have the artificial evaluation. And it's really a very, very tough thing to get over. It took me many, many years to deal with this whole idea, because it's so ingrained in our culture. So when I first heard about the spiritual path, when I was 18 years old, I found my first spiritual movement, Transcendental Meditation. In Transcendental Meditation, there was, probably still is, but there was a standard for how you were supposed to be as a good spiritual person who was a good meditator. How you dressed, how you talked, how you walked, all of these things. And so instead of having the standard I was brought up with, which was also an artificial standard, I now adopted a new standard for how I was supposed to be a spiritual person. Then a few years after that, I find a Summit Lighthouse and Ascended Master Organization, but I still took the teachings, or rather the culture in the organization, and adjusted my standard for what it meant to be a good Ascended Master student. And there was a very, very heavy culture in the Summit Lighthouse. Probably still is, I don't know. for how you're supposed to be, what you're supposed to do and not do in order to be a good Chela, as the saying was. And it took me many years to get to the point where I could look at this and evaluate this and say, but you know, I don't need this evaluation anymore, because I have enough connection to my higher self that I can experience intuitively without judging with the analytical mind, with the linear mind. The linear mind loves to have a standard to compare to. If I do this, then I'm okay. If I give enough prayers, if I give enough violet flame, I'm guaranteed to ascend. You know, this is what the linear mind loves, but that's not how life works. That's not how spiritual growth works. You have to shift your consciousness. It's not a matter of pretending. This is where so many spiritual people, and of course religious people, go wrong. So many Christians I've seen, they think that if I live up to these outer demands, whatever their church defines, you are baptized, you go to confession once a month, you go to Mass, all this stuff, then you are guaranteed to be saved. Or if you declare Jesus to be your Lord and Savior. Or if you give 3 hours of violet flame a day for the rest of your life, then you are guaranteed to ascend. All of these things. None of this stuff is going to do it in yourself. But the only thing that's going to make the difference in terms of you going into the ascended realm is you shift your consciousness. I've said this in several videos, the inner path and the outer path. And you know, when you are still on the outer path, you are looking for a standard. And you are thinking, oh, but now I found an Ascended Master organization, and they give their teachings from this higher level. So when they say don't drive a red car or a black car or this or that, which by the way they have never said through me, but it was said in the Summit Lighthouse, it was part of the culture there, then if I just follow that, I'll be okay. That's what the linear mind wants to think. But the only thing that really matters is your connection to your higher self and to the one mind, where you intuitively, spontaneously know what is in what would you call it, and in alignment with the one mind. What raises the whole. And it's just something that comes to you after a while. But there is a certain point on the path where you need to realize that you have, not only for this lifetime, but for many past lifetimes, you have created these very powerful subconscious selves that are based on this idea that there's a standard, and if you follow it. It's actually an interesting enigma, because the masters have even said this, that the people who are the most difficult to reach for the ascended masters are the people who think they are good. Whether they are good Christians, or good ascended master students, or good Buddhists, or good scientists or materialists, or good humanitarians who have done good works for others. In other words, you have people who have accepted a certain standard defined based on these two dualistic polarities. So they have accepted a standard for what it means to be a good person, and they have worked their whole life, perhaps several lifetimes, to live up to this standard, and they feel they do, and they are very, very good. But if it's a dualistic standard, it's not going to get you into the spiritual realm, and it's not going to help you ascend. You see what I'm saying? Whether you fail to live up to the standard, or whether you actually live up to it, it's going to get you nowhere, because you're still in separation. And even the people who feel they are so good, if they're still in separation, they are no closer to making the ascension. And this can be very, very difficult for people to admit this. I remember coming to actually really a kind of a crisis point where I have done all these outer things right to be a good Ascended Master student. But I had to come to a point where I realized it was driven by human ambition. It was partly driven by my ego, by these subconscious selves. And it really didn't make any difference. It didn't impress the Ascended Masters whatsoever, because they could easily see where it was coming from. I mean, I had to realize I couldn't hide anything from Jesus. He could see right through my ego, even if I couldn't, or even if other people couldn't. And I had to just decide to let it all go, because I realized I could keep doing this for the rest of my life and I still wouldn't qualify for my ascension. And I wanted to qualify for my ascension, so I had to do something differently. You keep doing the same thing and expect different results, you know. So I think it's very, very important to consider this. And it just, as you walk the path, as you work on these subconscious selves and they begin to fade away, then your desire to live up to this outer standard also fades away. And it's an enormous freedom to be free of it. I can think back, and I know I probably said something similar before about other things, but if I was to look at one thing that helped me, that really gave me a sense of peace of mind or a sense of relief or freedom, it was letting go of this idea that there's a standard I have to live up to. And it was challenging. First it was being a good spiritual student. Then in 2002 I started serving the Ascended Masters, bringing forth messages and teachings from them. And then I had to deal with what does it take to be a messenger for the Ascended Masters, a spiritual teacher. And again, there are standards. You can set up all kinds of standards. Because it's partly that the fallen beings are trapped in their own minds. They actually believe that if they live up to a certain standard, they can force God to recognize their separate selves as being worthy of attaining immortal life. They know their separate selves are mortal, but they are trying to make them immortal by making them live up to a standard. And they believe this is God's standard. But it's not. It's their own self-created standard, created out of the duality consciousness. And it just has no influence on God whatsoever. Because when you think about free will, you realize that God has given us free will. When we go into separation, we have the two basic ways of exercising our free will. One is we see ourselves as connected beings, we are striving to increase our connection. The other is we go into separation. And when we go into separation, we are saying we don't want to know about the one mind and raising all life. We want to define the standard in our minds based on being a separate self using the duality consciousness. We want to define the standard, the ultimate standard. And God says, you have a perfect right to go into separation. But nobody who is in the consciousness of separation will ever gain entry to the spiritual realm. Because you look at the murder and mayhem created from separation here on earth and imagine what it would do in the spiritual realm. So people who are in the spiritual realm have voluntarily given up using their free will to experiment with separation and duality. These are the two basic choices. And therefore God is saying, you have a right to go into separation. And you can go as far into separation as you can imagine. But you will never get into the spiritual realm, into oneness, until you give it up, the separate self. But what happens is that the fallen beings, once they get into this, they get trapped. And they're experiencing, we created this standard, but we still didn't get into the kingdom. We are still not immortal. So if we create a more absolute standard, the real absolute standard, and at one point they come to believe, but this must be God's standard. It must be God himself who has defined the standard. And it isn't. It's they themselves who have defined the standard. It's just, when I saw this, it was like the greatest epiphany, because I realized this, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. All what the fallen beings are trying to do, create these elaborate standards, these religions, political ideologies, philosophies, materialism, all of this stuff. It's just vanity. It's just complete emptiness. Complete emptiness. But if we just turn away from it all, give up these separate selves that have this standard, we can experience the kingdom of God. We can experience oneness. And it is so liberating, because what is it that happens when we go into this mindset of wanting to create this standard or live up to it? We are constantly tense. I look back at my early years on the spiritual path, and I have to laugh, because I think back, I was so tense. I was so intense because I was constantly evaluating every word I said, everything I did. Am I a good Chela? Am I not a good Chela? What does El Moya up there? How does he look at me? What does Saint Germain think I should be doing or shouldn't be doing? I was so tense about this. And I look at the Summit Lighthouse, there was tens of thousands of members in the Summit Lighthouse. I met many of them. They were just as tense as I was. Everybody was so tense. For that matter, even the messenger of the Summit Lighthouse, Elizabeth Care Prophet, she was tense. And I just look back at this and I'm thinking, oh my God, how could we even stand it? How could we even stand it? And I look at it today and I was thinking, oh my God, I can only laugh at it. You have to either laugh or cry. And I'm the kind of person, if that's the choice, then I always laugh. So it was just, it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. And it was based on this idea that if I live up to the standard that I think the Ascended Masters have defined, they'll let me ascend. But there is no cheating. There is no standard you could live up to that will qualify you for your ascension. Only the man, the person, the being who descended from heaven can ascend back from heaven, and that's the conscious you in its pure awareness. All the outer personality just has to go. It just has to go. And that was, the total liberation on the path from all of this tension. And I really hope that, well, what do I hope? I mean, I'm free of it, but still you can't help but wish that other people would be free of it too. And I really wish that some of the people that I knew in the Summit Lighthouse would come to that realization, whether they come to it because of me saying it or not. I know most of the people who were in the Summit Lighthouse reject me as a messenger because they think the last messenger was Elizabeth Care Prophet, and so they probably won't listen to anything I say. But I met so many very, very sincere people and very, very good people, and I wish they could come to this realization, that there's no standard you can live up to. It's just a matter of letting go of all these outer selves and accepting that you are worthy to ascend when you give up that outer standard. Because the standard imposed by the fallen beings, the standard can be defined in this world, is not the standard of the Ascended Masters. It never was, regardless of what we believed. But what we believed was what we could see at the time, and we were still in the Piscean age, and that was one of the big challenges humankind has to overcome in the Piscean age, is to free ourselves from the standard imposed by the fallen beings and realize that this has nothing whatsoever to do with the reality of the spiritual realm.